Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Railway Division of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers' very first webinar. And I hope that people are listening to this from all over the UK and perhaps even from other parts of the world. So we want to talk about electrification today, 25 kV electrification in particular, which, as many of you will know, as all of you will know, has been subject to somewhat of a setback in recent years, despite its acknowledged and avowed position as the best way of powering intense, fast or heavy trains pretty well all over the world. And to talk about the subject, which really is important to the institution and to the Railway Industry Association, from who our two presenters are today, we are also flagging a seminar on the 5th of June, where we're going to be exploring all the topics we talk about this afternoon in much greater detail, and that's at Birdcage Walk in London. But let me get on and introduce the speakers then. First up, Andy Mellors, who's now the Managing Director at South Western Railway, of course, Third Rail territory, but for 10 years prior to August 2017 was Engineering Director at Great Western Railway, and therefore oversaw the whole of the Great Western Electrification Programme introduction. And that will be followed immediately by David Clark, who's Technical Director at the Railway Industry Association, who's pulled together really quite a comprehensive and really interesting report, Electrification Cost Challenge, which I'd recommend to everyone on the call. So without further ado, really, over to you, Andy.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andy Mellors. I'm the current chair of the Railway Division of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, and I'm going to give an introduction in terms of a train operator's insight into rail electrification. So there are a few things I'm going to cover in the slides today. I'm going to talk about societal expectations, particularly in relation to climate change, the decarbonisation challenge that the industry faces. I'm going to talk a bit about what our customers in the industry actually want, and then finish, before handing over to David Clark, what does it actually mean for the rolling stock engineer. So, in terms of the Climate Change Act, actually as part of this webinar I started to do a little bit of research on this subject and realised that it's just over 10 years ago that legislation was put into place which put a target for 2050 in line with the Climate Change Committee's advice, and the target there actually compared to 1990 levels is at least an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And here we are almost halfway through that 60-year time horizon, and actually a reduction of 42% has already been achieved. So that's actually meant that the UK is seen as being quite world leading here compared to a number of other countries. But you know, despite those strong foundations, there's still a lot more work to do to meet that particular end goal. And I know certainly that, you know, as a train operator with a franchise agreement, the Department for Transport have now, as part of franchise agreements, started to include some quite challenging environmental targets, not just in respect of traction emissions, but also non-traction energy use as well. So really great challenge there to the industry to rise to, and I thought it was worth reflecting on a comparison of the different transport modes there, which you can see on the slide. And you can see here how rail generally compares very favourably to other forms of transport, particularly plane. I guess many of us already knew that. But you can actually see how within the different rolling stock fleets that are listed here, what variation there actually is in terms of CO2 emissions per passenger kilometre. And if we actually look into that trend at industry level, passenger and freight, a little more, you can see that for about the last 15 years, there's been almost continual improvement year on year in the passenger sector with reductions in emissions. And I guess we can sort of reflect on the fact that that's not only been delivered by technology, but as the next slide shows, has also been achieved through growth. Actually getting more people onto our trains does help improve that CO2 emissions metric as it's being measured in passenger kilometres. And maybe the challenge to us here is that we've been riding to some extent on the back of that growth trend in terms of seeing that continual year-on-year improvement in our emissions performance. So in terms of the decarbonisation task force, and I know we're going to hear more about that later, this particular challenge was laid at the industry's door in early 2018 by the then Rail Minister. And in reading the initial conclusions of that task force earlier this year, when their report was published in January, a conclusion there that the industry can rise to the challenge that was set last year by Joe Johnson to remove diesel-only passenger trains from the national network by 2040. But it's interesting to look at some of the things that are listed in that initial report, that there needs to be a mix of new traction options and efficiency improvements, and that electrification is currently the most carbon efficient power source, but it's not a silver bullet, and it can cause significant disruption and delays for passengers, and I'm going to come on to that a little later. And there's also mention in that decarbonisation task force report about how the industry and government should work together with research and development to look at alternative power sources such as bimode, hydrogen and battery. My next slide then looks at what our industry customers want, and I'm particularly looking at this from the passenger sector given my role within the industry. And I drew on Transport Focus's extensive research as most recently summarised earlier this month in a submission that they've made to the Williams Review. And the chart here shows priorities for passengers for areas of improvement on the rail network. And perhaps not surprisingly, the number one issue there is about price of train tickets and offering value for money. But below that top level statement, you can see that train capacity, punctuality and less disruption feature as numbers 2, 3 and 4 in the list. And I would contend that whatever we do as an industry in terms of rising to that emissions challenge and the decarbonisation aspirations, that we must absolutely not do anything that prejudices those particular issues, and wherever possible we should actually be facilitating improvements in capacity, punctuality, disruption, and indeed at number 11 in that list, reduced journey times as well. So what do we mean by train capacity? Well, it's not just about the absolute number of seats on trains, so anything we do in terms of train design needs to ensure that we maximise use of the available space for customers, but it's also about how those trains perform on the network and what it actually does in terms of overall network capacity. I'm going to come on and talk a little bit more about punctuality and specifically train reliability in a moment. But number 4 on that list is less disruption, and I guess it's important that we also reflect on the fact that that's not just about unplanned disruption on the day with infrastructure and rolling stock issues, but it's also about disruption when there is upgrade work on the network. And it's really important that we take cognizance of how we actually deliver enhancements on the network in order to reduce the disruption to customers, which ultimately has a bottom line impact on the finances of the industry. So when considering how to upgrade the network, and electrification in particular, it's really important that we don't just consider the activity of electrifying itself, but also the consequential impact on restrictions on the network. But what I think is really telling is in that list there's no mention at all of environmental credentials of the trains themselves, and maybe that's because that's not one of Transport Focus's questions, but it doesn't appear to be a particularly hot topic in this survey. Now, I wanted to give a particular example from my own history, having been engineering director at Great Western Railway, first Great Western as some would know it before then, as to how an electrification programme actually ticked a number of those particular passenger priorities. And that was the electrification of the Thames Valley network, which was the extension of the existing electrification that was put in over 20 years ago now for Heathrow Airport, out towards Maidenhead, Reading and Didcot. And that facilitated the introduction of brand new British-built electric trains, which not only delivered more capacity and better punctuality, but also allowed the cascade of existing diesel trains, scarce diesel trains, elsewhere on the network to deliver much needed capacity on non-electrified parts of the network. So it really was a much broader positive message for customers there than just the electrification of a part of the network itself. The next slide refers to a chart in the Decarbonisation Task Force report from earlier this year about different types of rolling stock for different types of operation. But I think returning to the point about punctuality and disruption, it's really important to consider that the more complex solution, the more the challenges on delivering it reliably. So my challenge here would be, does diversity equal more complexity, and does that mean less reliability? Because we know that in that list of passenger needs and wants that punctuality and disruption are really high on the agenda for improving. So my next slide gives a comparison as to how electric trains perform in relation to diesels, and I've used here reliability information from the Rail Delivery Group, where trains are categorised into a legacy category, trains that were built prior to rail privatisation, and then in the subsequent 3 eras of new train build since that time. And you can see that in all 4 of the categories, the absolute reliability when measured as miles between technical incidents, that is incidents causing 3 or more minutes of delay or a cancellation, is typically around double an electric train compared to a diesel. And whilst we've still got reliability growth with some of those more modern trains, you can see there that that's a pretty consistent picture, that an electric-only train delivers double the reliability of a diesel one. When it comes to actually recovering the service and the delay per incident of electrics compared to diesels, the picture is a little more mixed, as you can see in the lower half of that slide. But I guess we have to recognise that that is not just a reflection of to the nature of the individual faults that occur, but also about the intensity of the network utilisation and the ability to recover the service when a failure does occur. So moving on, and some of the challenges that we face here, I referred earlier to the Joe Johnson challenge of last year about removing diesel trains from the network. And at the time he made clear that further electrification wasn't actually in scope. And a few months after that challenge was laid at the industry, here's a newspaper item where the same minister went on record to publicly say that electrification was a waste of money. So that sort of epitomises the challenge that we face here in terms of convincing our funders. And when it comes to the UK track record, it's perhaps not surprising to see that we have challenges here in terms of cost and supply chain capability. When you look at the chart here as to how a relatively steady state production line of electrification in Germany compares to the stop-start nature of electrification in the UK, is it any wonder why we have some of the challenges that we've experienced in the last few years? And as we prepared for this webinar, I noticed that in the March edition of Modern Railways, Roger Ford has written about the Andrew McNaughton report, which was commissioned last year by the Department for Transport. And Andrew quotes, "Electrification is a production line activity, and most successful outcomes have happened when this has been respected by the client arranging a continuing steady programme of work, which the supply chain learns to be confident of and invests in equipment, processes, skills and resources accordingly." And returning to the climate change position, I thought perhaps it was worth reflecting on the fact that not only was there a mention of Scotland in the previous slide about their experience that electrification doesn't have to be excessively expensive, but the Committee on Climate Change actually did cite Scotland as a devolved administration as leading the UK nation in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In terms of what does it all mean for the rolling stock engineer then, I thought I'd cite a couple of examples in drawing my part of the presentation to a close. And last year at the Railway Challenge, it was really pleasing to see the great spirit that was happening there in terms of young engineers, problem solving, battling with challenges to get their locomotives out on the track. And worth reflecting on the fact that in that very small scale environment, the innovation that has been encouraged over the years, particularly with regards to the hydrogen-powered locomotive developed by the University of Birmingham, has actually more recently led on to bigger things with their collaboration with Porterbrook, the rolling stock leasing company, to convert a surplus Class 319 unit into a hydrogen-powered train. But there is more that we can do with the existing diesels as well, and mindful of that emissions target reduction that I mentioned of 2050 earlier, if we have diesel-only trains around for another 20 years, doing nothing is not going to be an option. So the importance of actually cleaning up our existing diesels is really important too. And I thought I'd particularly cite there a recent announcement where Porterbrook, IMechE and my own business, South Western Railway, are partnering to deliver some quite significant improvements into emissions from existing diesel engines on our Class 158 and 159 trains. So in conclusion, I think that customers are largely agnostic to the environmental credentials of the individual types of train. What they're interested in, according to the Transport Focus research, is punctuality, not having disruption and being able to get a seat. And as the Decarbonisation Task Force have said in their initial report, electrification is the first choice for decarbonisation, and that can support those key passenger priorities that I've already mentioned. We know that autonomous or bi-mode trains are really not a silver bullet. Anything that introduces diversity and complexity must absolutely not be to the detriment of reliability. We also need to make sure when upgrading our railway that upgrade work is clearly understood and articulated to customers and stakeholders. There is no gain without pain. And where we have line closures to provide the opportunities to upgrade the infrastructure, it's really important that customers are able to see something tangible at the end of that in terms of how we've improved their journey experience. And as was recommended by the institution earlier this year in their report on hydrogen trains, the UK government really should rethink the cancellation of the electrification programme and move forward with a more innovative and long-term approach along the lines as I outlined from the Andrew McNaughton report published earlier this year. So with that, I'm going to hand over to David Clark, who's Technical Director of the Railway Industry Association. David.
Thank you, Andy. This afternoon I want to talk about the rear electrification cost challenge. As well as my day job, I'm also a member of the Decarbonisation Task Force, and as Andy has already mentioned, one of the things that the task force identified is that there's no silver bullet to the challenge of decarbonising the rail industry. But what they do say is electrification is the first choice in a hierarchy of options to decarbonise the network. They could have put a rider to that. They could have said it's the first choice if the cost is affordable, and that's been the issue in recent times. It's always been RIA's position that electrification brings huge benefits to the railway in terms of reliability, as Andy's already covered, often in terms of speed, often in terms of capacity, and it should be the most efficient way to run your railway in the long term. The challenge has been, the perception recently is that it's not affordable. And that's why we set about doing the rear electrification cost challenge. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to just remind you a little bit about the way that electrification strategy has played out in the UK in the past 10 years or so. I'm going to talk about the National Electrification Programme, which started in 2009, and what we learned from that. And I'm going to talk about what electrification should cost. So since 2007, the Railway Electrification Programme in the UK has been on a bit of a stop-start journey. Back in 2007, it was initially stopped with the delivering a sustainable railway white paper, perhaps getting a bit ambitious in terms of the availability of new technology and assuming that there was no need for further electrification as new technology would obviate the need for electrification. That led to an influential letter from Ian Coucher of Network Rail and Adrian Shooter of ATOC, which pointed out that even if all that were true, it would take some time for the technology to mature, and in the meanwhile, we might as well be delivering the benefits of electrification to passengers. That led to a change in position and a paper in 2009 from the government, which kicked off a substantial programme of electrification, including the North West and Great Western. That programme continues today, actually, but in the period 2012 to 2014, there was some serious cost escalation on a number of projects, in particular Great Western, or notably Great Western. Other projects had their problems, but Great Western seemed to grab the headlines in that respect. That led to, in 2015, a pause in a number of programmes while the situation was reappraised, and then a critical National Audit Office report in 2016 about Great Western, which led in 2017 to the decision that electrification programmes would be curtailed because bi-mode trains offered new options. Then, moving the clock forward into 2018, as we've already heard from Andy, we had the situation where the Rail Minister at the time, Joe Johnson, set a challenge to decarbonise. So, as the question mark says, where does that leave us now? And the answer is, the position, as I've already said, is that both the Decarbonisation Task Force and RIA are saying that electrification ought to be the best way to run an intensively used railway. The challenge is that the cost hasn't been right. And that's the reason behind our Electrification Cost Challenge report. And what we were trying to do here is assist the industry, the whole of the industry, the client and the supplier, and government make the right decisions around the network in terms of rail electrification. critically to restoring government's confidence in the ability of the rail industry to deliver on time and to budget and affordably. And highlight evidence that electrification can be and is being delivered for between a third and a half of the costs experienced on some of the recent projects that had problems. And to do that, we use examples from around the UK of real projects and international projects. And we also, in doing that, flushed out a lot of really good practice that the electrification programme had delivered. And that gives us some confidence that going forward we can potentially do even better. But critically to all of this, we believe that there's a need for at least a 10-year rolling programme of activity to help decarbonise the network. And what that will do is enable the industry to deliver schemes at much lower cost because they've retained the learning and skills and are able to incentivise investment in new people, plant and process. This is not about pointing the finger or blaming anybody for why certain projects had problems in the last 5 or so years. The whole industry has a case to answer in the issues that arose, and everybody was trying to do the best they possibly could, but there was a whole range of circumstances that prevented the industry delivering effectively on certain projects. However, equally, as I'll show later, many projects were successfully delivered. It started well. The 2009 report I mentioned earlier in 2012 gave rise to a big programme of electrification. The issue, I think, here is summarised on this slide, which actually shows the leap from a very small volume of activity in the previous 5 years, about 400 million, which was all around refurbishment of the Great Eastern and the West Coast mainlines, to 4 billion of activity, not just on one project, but on multiple projects. So from a standing start, the industry was expecting to do many times more in terms of volume and many times more projects than they'd done in a very long time. And many of the challenges of that growth were recognised. There was a lot of good work done on skills. The industry stepped forward and created new consortia to ramp up and create delivery capability. There was lots of good practice activity, and there was investment in high output equipment to deliver productivity. So in many ways, lots of good ideas at the outset and a sensible approach. But perhaps some of the challenges weren't fully recognised. There was some issues, some changes around standards. We had an issue that the new high output plant, which in many ways was probably the right answer, we were trying to introduce that on a live project. The acceleration from 200 million to 4 billion compared to the previous 5 years, lack of experience. This was the first major programme in 20 years, and a number of other issues. So what happened and what have we learned? Well, as I've already alluded to, it had been 20 years since the last major electrification programme, and the industry then moved from practically nothing in 20 years to a 2,000 kilometre programme. And as you can see on the right-hand side of this slide, that's a picture in 2013 of all the live projects. And that would have been a challenge, but also the finish date had been set, particularly on the Great Western route, by a fixed date for the delivery of new trains. So already we were in a position, almost before we started the project, where there was a fixed end date. So the lessons there clearly are having a realistic programme based on a proper understanding of the scope of works and having the experienced resource to deliver it. We were bringing in novel technology. We were bringing in a high output system comprising a plant on the right hand side and a purpose designed new electrification system which was designed for ease of construction and together they were intended to deliver high productivity in the inevitably constrained possession access regime on a main line like Great Western or Midland main line. And in many ways, that was a very logical approach. The issue, as I've already alluded to, was it was very soon apparent that we were trying to, as an industry, introduce that new technology at the same time as we were building the new railway. And we weren't just introducing it on a modest project where we had chance to learn by experience and improve productivity and get up a learning curve. We were introducing it on one of the major main lines in the UK. So we had a situation where development of the system was overlapping with design and delivery. So there's a lesson here about proven technology. Having done all of those trials and gone through the learning curve, as it were, out of harm's way. And that, not in itself, resulted in poor productivity and rework, but the fact that we were trialling a new system, or developing a new system and implementing a new system on the Great Western specifically, we then had, that issue was then compounded by some issues with the early foundation designs, which resulted in very long piles. And also, as you can see on the picture, top right there, there was a decision made to put the piles out beyond the cable runs in the CES. The result of those two issues, long piles and the long reach to the pile position, meant that the factory train that had been procured couldn't drive those piles at an acceptable rate to the required depth. The upshot of which was very poor productivity and missed piles, gaps and as you'll appreciate, you need a continuous run of piles before you can come back in and erect the masts and then erect the wires. So the high output system might have had its challenges in terms of being introduced, but I think the compounding issue was the initial design of the piles, which once productivity became poor and there wasn't opportunities readily available to get back in and fill in those gaps, then the program got into real difficulties. Network Rail then identified that perhaps there was an issue with the pile design and undertook full-scale tests and ultimately reverted to a previous empirical design method, because by then they demonstrated that under the new loading regimes that the empirical method was still adequate for the vast majority of situations. So we find ourselves now today where we wouldn't be putting in piles of that length, but by then the program slippage had occurred and that wasn't recovered. So again, there's a lesson here about proven methodology. GWEP wasn't the only project that experienced difficulties, but it was probably the most prominent, not least because it was the subject of a National Audit Office report, and it was the location where the new equipment was being introduced. And as I've already said, it had a fixed deadline. Back in 2009, when the budget was set, already we knew that we were looking to deliver the trains in July 2017, which set a fixed date for the completion of the work. And as you can see, there was steady cost escalation as the team got a better knowledge of the work ahead of them. But the biggest cost escalation was once the physical work started on site. And I would suggest the difference between the last two bars, the 2013 and 2016 bar, is the effect of this poor productivity and program difficulties that resulted in. And I'd suggest that leads to a lesson that early collaboration and design development and not having a fixed deadline at that point mitigates risk. But what we found in our investigations is that while some projects had experienced difficulties, and they're the ones on the left here on this chart, many actually in the same period had been successfully delivered. And it's quite easy to see at least two ranges of cost here of real programs that have delivered successfully. So there's some simpler projects, less complex projects, perhaps with better access or less physical constraints, that we see delivering in the 0.75 or £750,000 to £1 million range, and then a number of more complex projects delivering in a range of £1 million to £1.5 million per single track kilometre. So, and above that, as you can see, there are a number of projects, some of which I've previously mentioned, which experience delivery difficulties. So it's our view that it's perfectly plausible for the future to expect simpler projects to be delivered in the range that I've mentioned, and more complex projects to be delivered for less than £1.5 million per single track kilometre. Now that's a half to a third of the cost of some of the projects that experience difficulties. And so it's RIA's position that electrification should be deliverable within those cost ranges, and anything that is looking to cost more than that, there has to be a very, very good reason, and that would be something that would be subject to very careful analysis to justify why the project is so complex or challenging that it should cost more than that. So what we conclude from that is there is an efficient cost range, substantially less than the perception of electrification costs, which has been driven, I would suggest, by those projects that experienced difficulties in the last 5 years or so. But it is fair to say that complexity is a cost driver. So it's not as simple as to say that there is a rate that you can use for estimating. Absolutely, a unit cost is not an estimating tool. It's also very true to say that access is a cost driver. But taking those factors into consideration, there's no doubt in our mind that electrification can be delivered within these cost ranges for typical projects. And we think also there's scope to do better. I've already alluded to all of the good practice that's been identified through the process of the report that we've written, and if you refer to the report online, you'll find that a good 2/3 of the report is all about the good practice. So we already know that we can deliver at the rates that I just described. We also know that we've learned a lot of good practice. We also know that in Germany, as this graph which Andy's already shown you, they've shown that they can deliver more efficiently using a rolling program of electrification. So it's very much our view that if you bring together that good practice and a rolling program, then we can do even better than the costs that I've just described that have been delivered on actual projects in the last 5 or so years. Thank you very much.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to me. I'm Ian Flynn, Institution of Mechanical Engineers, co-chair of the events committee, and we are putting on an event to this very theme, rebuilding confidence, railway electrification, rebuilding confidence. That will be on the 5th of June at Birdcage Walk. Now, I'm proud to say that we've got 250 people on our very first Railway Division webinar here today, and I'm hoping therefore to encourage questions, because the goal of the institution really is to provoke and encourage debate, particularly on engineering and policy matters around the industry. We're here to serve the industry, and we're here to give a platform to the issues of the day, and this very much is. So you've heard from David there, author of the actually quite excellent report, Electrification Cost Challenge. I do recommend that you all read that. And before that, the current chair of the Railway Division, also managing director of the South Western Railway, Andy Mellors. So I'm going to start the questions, because a fair few have come in already, with one from Casper Lucas from Oslo Kipi. who's asking us, and I'll ask you both this question actually, at 2 points really. A specific reference made to brand new bridge-built trains on the Thames Valley route after electrification. How important is this? If older trains were brought in for electrification, or if they're built abroad, does this in any way damage the business case for electrification? So maybe starting with you, Andy.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I think the particular point I'd make there is that at the point that electrification happened, new trains were really the only option in the absence of any cascaded train availability. Obviously, that position has now changed quite a bit within the industry, and I've mentioned in my section of the presentation some of the opportunities that had afforded in terms of trialling new technology with the hydrogen train. I think the other point I'd make there is that the procurement of new trains, in terms of the ability to apply other technology, particularly in that particular example I used on the Thames Valley, the adoption of selective door opening also meant that additional capacity was able to be provided without necessarily being linked to platform extension. So I think it's very situational depending upon where you are, what the rolling stock market is like at the time, the availability of cascaded trains, and I think we also have to recognise, there is inevitably a need to consider what the proposition means for customers in terms of what rolling stock do they already enjoy, and therefore what is being provided going forward needs to be seen as at least comparable with that, and certainly not a retrograde step.
Okay, so thanks. David, I know that your association represents the entire industry, and that includes, that's irrespective of where people are based. Maybe you could add to that?
Well, yes, we do represent the entire industry, both infrastructure, rolling stock, and their suppliers. And that brings me to the point that any business case for the railway needs to be considered as a whole system business case, and electrification is no different. And so in an electrification business case, you're often considering the business case over a very long period, can be 40 or 60 years in appraisal. And the electrification for an intensively used railway is always the best business case, I would suggest. The issue, providing we can deliver it affordably, and that's what our report is all about. The issue very often is affordability, in other words, cash flow. So it might be the best thing to do for the long term. The issue is whether the country can afford to do it at this particular point in time, which is why you can't do it all at once, and therefore I would suggest there needs to be a strategy, hence our suggestion for a rolling programme. Now, flipping to other alternatives beyond 25 kV wires for electrification, other modes of self-powered train, again, they have to be considered as a whole system business case, be it bi-mode, be it hydrogen, be it battery, whatever. They all have their costs which have to be factored into the business case. And what I think we need to do more of is having a strategy and a business case to support that strategy.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, so recognising we've got 15 minutes or so left, I'm going to wrap up several related questions all together here. And I know this is bound to come up at some point, so let's deal with it now. So Malcolm DeBell, London Underground Non-Exec Director, is asking, what about demonstrating that hydrogen is not feasible for freight except for the last mile? And we've also got several other questions. I've got dozens of questions coming in here, but Johnny Yates is asking about hybrid trains. Simon Stringfellow, is hydrogen actually cost effective as one potential way forward, or is it just a green tick in the box? Simon's of TNRS Engineering, and Johnny's of WADTech. So I think there are more questions like that. Now, we will be covering this topic in quite some detail on the 5th of June, but in the meantime, David, you've looked at this closely. What do you think?
Okay, well, I've looked at it not in the report we've been talking about, but I'm a member of the Decarbonisation Task Force. One thing that we do mention in the report is that I think we're increasingly envisaging the railway being considered in sort of three segments. The first segment is the bit that's intensively used and where there's a business case to electrify. And our aspiration through the report is to get a rolling program going that increases the footprint of electrification. At the other end of the spectrum, there's the less intensively used parts of the network, where there's probably never going to be a case to electrify traditionally, the cost of overhead line outweighing the benefits of the number of trains under the wires. And in that case, certainly for passenger, and as Malcolm has picked up, Dobell has picked up, there's certainly a challenge with freight. But for passenger, you're there looking for a self-powered train. And so for medium distance self-powered electric train, hydrogen is certainly looking like a viable alternative. And I just mentioned that there's certainly quite a move towards hydrogen being a major fuel in other parts of industry. So, for instance, to address the challenge of decarbonising heating would be, for instance. So hydrogen is going to become an increasingly important fuel, not because the railway wants it to, but therefore the railway can benefit from it. There's then the bit in the middle between those two extremes, you might call it the grey area, where currently we're using things like bi-mode trains, we're using things like batteries, and indeed hydrogen to, as it were, bridge the gap off the end of the wires. And I think the challenge for us is to look forward maybe 15 years or so and envisage a situation where we've done 15 years of rolling programs, we've moved the frontier of electrification out, and also gradually the range of self-powered trains has improved such that the bit in the middle diminishes to practically nothing.
All right. So just in a word then, David, do you really see an 8 megawatt freight local powered by hydrogen in the next 10 years?
No, I don't think we will. I think the energy storage for hydrogen is so you'd lose a lot of your a lot of the freight runs to haul cargo. If you use a significant chunk of that to haul your fuel, the economics of freight gets significantly diminished. I think we ran an event, as RIA ran an event last week where we brought in the automotive industry, and I think they are quite rightly looking at, and we are looking as the rail industry to collaborate with them. They're looking at the things we used to call internal combustion engines, and now the sort of politically correct term appears to be thermal engines. But liquid fuel or gaseous fuel is pretty efficient. It's a question of where you get that from. And there's lots of things can be done to make diesels more efficient. There is a piece of research going on at the moment which will feed into the next bit of the decarbonisation task force.
Okay, so recognising that there really are dozens of questions here, and it's great that there's such interest, I'd like to ask Mark Loder's question. I had the great pleasure of working with Mark many years ago on the Underground. Mark's in Malaysia at the moment and asks where there's extensive electrification going on there. We've heard of the causes of cost escalation and past electrification, such as poor design, but what has been put in place to stop the same issues arising on future projects? And I'll ask you to start, Andy, but I know that, David, your report also covers this ground too.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I think the challenge that we have here, is very well sort of articulated in the National Audit Office report that David mentioned. I think lessons are starting to be learnt there. You'll see that I specifically mentioned Scotland in my slides, where there has been some good progress. And I think David covered off the fact that there are some real tangible success stories out there as to where unit costs have actually been reduced. I think for me the single sort of biggest issue, going back to my experience on Great Western, was the extent to which electrification schemes and extensions to the scheme were announced when the concept was very immature, and that really was really the point at which the challenges with cost escalation started to creep in. So I think all the things that I and particularly David have talked about in terms of having a much more sort of conveyor belt approach to schemes and infrastructure upgrades is actually something that is now contemplated in control period 6, with enhancement funding being considered on a case by case basis, rather than a once every 5 years, where inevitably schemes will be at different stages in their development.
Okay, David, I know that your report does cover extensively what we need to do electrification better. The report mentions frequently through it the need to not forget lessons that have already been learned the hard way and stuff. But as opposed to Mark's question, are the 2 or 3 things that you can really advocate doing? What are if I were to ask you for 2 things that needed to be done to make sure that electrification schemes are implemented cost effectively, what would they be?
I think, well, first of all, I'd very quickly say that a lot of the lessons are being learned, as demonstrated by the cost that more recent projects have been delivered at. And I think probably the couple of things that I would look to do is I would look to segment the program so that, for instance, you do all the route clearances, i.e. the bridges, separately from the overhead lines, so you deconflict those aspects. And the other thing I would look to do is to get the overhead line design mature at a very early stage. When this sounds obvious, but before you start work on site. And that's what those 2 things are things that recent projects are doing and doing well. The reason why some of the projects that didn't go so well didn't do that is simply because they were up against a time pressure that prevented them doing so.
So, okay, great. So on the subject of overhead line electrification equipment, I'm going now to ask a question from Noel Dolphin of Furrer and Frey. Electrification has all sorts of benefits, says Noel. Electrification are more reliable, have more capacity, and we know those things. And your paper is a great start to change the narrative on electrification. But what are the next steps?
Okay, well, the next steps are keeping the issue in the public eye, and there's a lot going on at the moment, of which this webinar is one example, and the conference later, seminar later in the year is another. You will have seen a lot in the trade press in the past week or so since we published the report. We have written to government. Indeed, in fact, we've got an event at Parliament tomorrow afternoon. But we've written to government looking for a meeting to discuss the report, because this report, which has been supported by Network Rail, is effectively Network Rail and ourselves answering part of the question that the Transport Select Committee put to us. And the Transport Select Committee said they wanted Network Rail, DfT and RIA to investigate the case for a rolling programme of electrification, and they wanted to do that within 12 months. That 12 months runs out in September. So between now and September, the challenge is the opportunity is to engage with DfT and wider government and make that case.
Okay. Andy, have you got any thoughts about what the next steps are?
Yeah, I think I mentioned there the control period 6 approach to enhancement funding. So the fact that the industry collectively has sort of opportunities there to create this pipeline, subject to satisfying government that the value for money is there. So I think we do have a better opportunity now to sort of move towards the sort of approach that David has outlined.
Okay, so I'm going to ask now a question from Keith Parkin, Keithy's Share Limited. So there's quite a lot to Keith's question, but his central point is that David, your namesake at the Energy Technologies Institute, put this very well. Joined up thinking and collaborative working is necessary, not something rail is known for. That's what's required. What will UK Rail do to address this critical area? Now, I'd certainly say that this webinar and our following on seminar examples of cross-industry working, as indeed is the report that we have produced. Perhaps there's more evidence of cross-working thinking going on than people necessarily always sometimes see. But what do you two guys think about that, and what does Williams need to take away from the errors of the past?
Well, I think I'd sort of just elaborate on something I mentioned in my presentation, Ian, which was the partnership between Porterbrook, IMechE, and South Western Railway, my own sort of business, as to what we're actually doing there in terms of tackling the sort of diesel emissions challenge with the residual diesel fleet. And there we've worked in a collaborative manner with the three organisations to get DFT funding through Innovate UK's first of a kind funding, and there's a good example as working with a supplier that has many years of experience in the sort of road sector to try and harness that technology for use in rail. So there's a clear imperative there where my sort of franchise has some challenging carbon reduction targets over the life of the franchise, and the funding that's been facilitated through that mechanism has encouraged that partnership and collaboration.
Sure. Absolutely. David, I know that you've been a long-term advocate of doing things better. Do you think we're moving in the right direction as an industry?
I'd like to think so. I mean, the question that Keith raises is a wide one. It's about energy security, and he's quite right. It's also about collaboration. And ironically enough, back in 2007, 2009, we had a strategy, and we had collaboration in developing that strategy. And then, for reasons which we cover in the report, we managed as a collective industry to make a bit of a mess of it, or at least some of it. Certain projects got headlines while other projects were delivering well. So we've got ourselves in a position where electrification got a bad name, and we're trying to restore it. But what I think is a significant change in the last 10 years, the last time we were looking at a program of electrification, we were looking at it because it was a better way to run your railway. And that's still true. But what has changed since then is the carbon agenda, the decarbonisation and indeed emissions agenda coming much, much more to the fore. And that is pan-industry. That's not a rail thing. And I think we will see legislation potentially coming down the line that will make that absolutely clear that there's not an opt-out for any sector, and that will drive us needing to be collaborative across sectors and across rail.
Okay, so it's coming up, ladies and gentlemen, to 1 o'clock, and I think we have to wrap up very, very soon now. Just for completeness, Philip Haig has asked about the better acceleration of trains and its effect on capacity. Well, I can certainly say that having worked on the underground for years, and we absolutely trained and know for sure that the capacity of the system is maximised by getting trains through the system as aggressively as possible, as quickly as possible in terms of acceleration and braking. And that is the fundamental feature of maximising capacity of railway systems, that's absolutely a contribution that electrification can make. Just again, quickly running out of time here, we're going to make these slides available we're going to either email them to everybody who participated, or else we'll put them on the website, one or the other. I'd just like to hand it back finally to Andy and Dave to conclude, really.
Okay, Andy, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's a great opportunity to get this really important subject aired. So, really grateful for the opportunity to do the webinar today, and of course promote that seminar that we have at Birdcage Walk in early June. So look forward to hearing more then about this really important topic that is grabbing the headlines now. We only have to look at the publication of the decarbonisation report. There's a lot of coverage of this in recent editions of some of the railway publications, including Modern Railways that I was reading only earlier today. So really great that we're getting this exposure, and we'll explore more in early June.
Thank you, Andy. And Dave, I'll give the last word to you, I think.
Okay, well, I'd just like to thank everybody for joining the webinar today, and more broadly, I'd like to thank the industry for the extraordinary level of support that we've had from across the industry, both in the preparation of the Cost Challenge report and since it's been published. There's clearly a very strong opinion that supports our position that electrification is the best way to run an intensively used railway, and we've shown that it can be done cost effectively. So the challenge now is to make the case to get on with it. So thank you everybody for your support in that.
Yes, fantastic questions. I've got a whole bunch of them here. It's really deeply frustrating that we've run out of time. We are planning very much to have a good discussion at the end of the seminar on the 5th of June. And any of you who come to that, ask your questions in person. And what we'd really like to do is make quite a statement from the industry to the powers that be, as it were, to say that this is the voice of the railway industry on the subject of electrification. And with that, I'm going to close today's event. Thanks, everyone.